be recorded and made available to all participants in the coming days. So if you're not able to stay for the entire session, or if you just want to listen to it again, it will be available. So I now have the pleasure of passing on the mic back to Rumit, who will take us off on this wonderful workshop. Thank you. Thanks, Rumit.
Thank you so much, Dominica. And again, I'm so glad to be joining all of you. And I am gathered on the Mississaugas territory. So thank you, Dominica, for beginning with that. And I also want to mention that, as Dominica has said, this session will be recorded. And following this session, you will receive a copy of all of the slides, as well as a link to our feedback survey. We are going to go through quite a bit of content. However, again, you're going to get the recording, you're going to get the slides, and we are going to touch on not only emotional intelligence, but also happiness and well-being. To provide a little bit of context in terms of emotional intelligence, especially during the time of pandemic for leaders, we're going to kick off today by exploring what's happening around the world, what's happening in our backyards, what's happened over the last 5.5 months. We're going to get into an activity that I like to call What Makes a Great Leader, and we'll be using the chat box function for that. I'll provide you with an introduction to emotional intelligence and speaking about the different subscales that are connected to it. And we will end off today speaking about happiness and well-being. This is a 2-hour workshop. We will be finishing at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today, and I will be providing a short break in between, as well as a very small stretch break in the home stretch of our session together. I want to start off by sharing this quote by David Corey. To lead with emotional intelligence is to inspire, motivate, and instill a sense of worth, belonging, and confidence. It is to compel others to work to their fullest potential. And as leaders, we have the ability to do so. Now, when we think about what's happening, it has been, as of today, exactly 171 days since the World Health Organization announced that what it is that we are experiencing is a pandemic. 171 days on Friday, March 13th, 2020. Now, when this was announced, I mean, all of us had an idea of where we would be over the next week. Perhaps some of us were going to be on March break holidays with our families. Some of us had an idea of where we were going to be during the summer. And that completely changed 171 days ago. Now, with change, there comes feelings of fear, of loss, whether that's loss of certainty or loss of a loved one during this time, anxiety, and grief. Right? So we had this certainty of, I know where I'm going to be next week or during the summer or in the fall, and we were thrown off our equilibriums. And so some of us may have been grieving that loss of certainty. We also know that not everyone has experienced the pandemic in the exact same way. How you have experienced the pandemic may have been very different than how I've experienced the pandemic. I know that the students that I teach, they've experienced a pandemic in different ways. And so when we think from a leadership lens of how we connect with others, this idea of practical empathy is so important. And I'm going to talk about empathy as we go through the different subscales of emotional intelligence today. I also want to mention, because it is just as important and very much connected to emotional intelligence, is this echo pandemic that we've been experiencing as it relates to our well-being and our mental health. So there's a difference between wellness and well-being. Wellness refers to our physical health, and well-being refers to our mental, emotional, and our physical health. And so we know that there have been various challenges as it relates to well-being for Canadians during this time. And so there was a study done by the Angus Reid Institute that showed that 50% of Canadians indicated that their mental health has worsened during the pandemic. The Canadian Mental Health Association came out with a study that shared that Canadians were experiencing more negative emotions versus positive emotions. Now, to add to that, the data showed that 77% of Canadians, when they were asked the question, "How are you?" would respond with, "I'm fine, thanks." Even though the data shows that we are experiencing, some of us, more negative emotions versus positive emotions. And there was another study done, the Mental Health Index by Myrno Chappell. And what this study showed was a direct link to the mental health of Canadians and the support or lack thereof that they've received from their employer. And 34% of respondents had shared that their employer was either inconsistent or responded poorly or very poorly to the mental health issues that have arisen during this time. So a lot has happened in the last 171 days. And it absolutely connects to emotional intelligence, and especially for us as leaders. And so I want to bring up this quote that came from a fantastic article, one of the best ones that I've read during this time on mental health. And the link is in the source of this PDF, which again, you'll have access to after our session together. Now, Mark Hennick is a mental health strategist, and he shares how our brain does not let us process traumatic events until a threat is over. So only after that threat is over will our brain process trauma that we've experienced. And this could have been caused by financial pressures, social isolation, or life-altering changes. As an example of that, a loss of a loved one. So what this means is that, you know, those that we lead, our family members, those that we care about, may not be as mentally healthy as they appear. And as leaders, we want to be very aware of this, that those that we communicate with, connect with, they may not appear, or they may not be as mentally healthy as they appear. And even looking internally, when we think about emotional intelligence, it's also building our self-awareness on our own well-being, checking in with ourselves. How am I doing? How am I feeling? What am I excited about? What am I not so excited about? And building that self-awareness, because that's the goal of emotional intelligence. The goal is not to say that you'll never be stressed out again. Absolutely not. We are going to experience stress. The goal of emotional intelligence is to build our self-awareness so that then we can develop strategies to navigate those times that may be challenging. So when we think of emotional intelligence, I want to start by talking about neuroscience. And I always start by talking about neuroscience because sometimes I have participants that, you know, why are we going to be talking about emotional intelligence for the next 2 hours? Why are we talking about feelings? And what neuroscience tells us is that every time you process an emotion, within 6 seconds, it impacts every living cell in your body. You have a biological and physical response every time you process an emotion, and it impacts how you act, react, and interact, whether that's with others or, most importantly, I would argue, with yourselves. And now the thing is, we are constantly sending and receiving emotional messages, and this can actually alter the set point of your cells. So you might have a virtual coffee with someone and leave feeling completely exhausted. Or you might leave feeling completely energized and inspired because it's how you interpreted what was in front of you, but it had a biological impact. Now, the beautiful part about emotional intelligence is that these are skills, what we're going to talk about today. These are skills that can be developed, and our emotional intelligence changes over time. Now, that's not to say that it's going to go just straight up like this, right? It depends on what we're going through, right? So I was working with someone and she was going through a divorce, and that was impacting things like how she felt about herself, how she was able to look at things objectively and reasonably. And so when we think about emotional intelligence, again, the goal, let's build our self-awareness, because once we build our self-awareness, we can then develop strategies. And my goal here today is not to just talk about emotional intelligence and the different subskills. I am here to provide practical tools, tips, evidence-based interventions that can help us to build that self-awareness and navigate through the challenges that we experience. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do a short activity, and we're going to be using the chat box for this. What I'd like you to do is open up the chat box, and you're going to answer the following question. And what's the first word or a couple of words that pop into your mind when I ask this question? What makes a great leader? Someone who is ... So you're going to use the chat box. What makes a great leader? What are the words? What are the qualities? What are the characteristics of a great leader? So let's go over to the chat box and see what you have to say. All right. We have open-minded, collaborative, empathetic, bold. I've got empathetic again, inspirational, listening and hearing. And there's a difference, right? You can hear me, but are you listening to me? Inspiring, someone that understands the needs of the population that they're serving. Balance, so important, and we'll talk about that today. Someone who instills confidence, a visionary, someone who sees, of course, what's in front of them, someone who's present, finds strength in others, listening with compassion, one who sets a good example to others. Thank you so much for participating in that. And then we've also got humor. Excellent. Now, I ask you this question because if you look at the list that you have created that makes a great leader, all of those attributes connect to emotional intelligence. So this is what you are saying makes a great leader, not me. Someone who's empathetic, open-minded, someone who listens, right? All of these things are important to making a great leader. And for decades, we used to call these the soft skills. And we tended to focus on the hard and technical skills for development and label these as soft skills when actually these are essential skills required for 21st century leadership. And what's beautiful about the skills that you've just listed is that they're transferable regardless of the job that you are in. And so if we think about what makes a great leader, this is why we're here today, to talk about these skills and these qualities, and more importantly, to have the tools and strategies in order to develop them. This is the framework of emotional intelligence. We're not going to talk about all 15 of the subskills. I've pulled out the ones that are most relevant to our session, as well as what's relevant to the times and what we're experiencing and what's happening. You'll notice that the model is circular. There's no start point and there's no end point. There's not a number that we can reach and say, okay, I'm emotionally intelligent and that's it. Because again, depending on what it is that we're going through, our emotional intelligence is going to change over time. And going back to the previous slide, the beautiful part is that it absolutely is something that can be developed. So the first piece that we're going to talk about and actually spend the most time on together is self-perception. And this is at the foundation of emotional intelligence, how we view ourselves and also how we feel about ourselves. And the first subskill that falls under self-perception is self-regard. Now, I will tell you, I've worked with thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And across the board, it doesn't matter the age, doesn't matter the gender they identify with, doesn't matter their position title. Could have been a 16-year-old male student or a 65-year-old female CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, and everyone in between. The number one thing that people want to develop further is their self-confidence, their self-regard, how they feel about themselves. And when we look at self-confidence, the true definition is knowing that one can rely on their strengths and abilities in any given situation. What does that mean? What that means is you could throw anything at me and I know I'm going to get through it. Well, how do you know? You know because you've gone through obstacles and challenges. And I want to use this pandemic as a great example. And I'm going to give you the example of new teachers. Or teachers in general. So 5.5 months ago, 171 days ago, we were thrown off our equilibriums. We had to develop new ways of communicating, of living, of working, of interacting. And what actually ended up happening over those 5.5 months, we developed new routines because we had to. And we developed new ways of connecting and interacting. And so we adjusted. Not that to say that the new ways were optimal, but we adjusted over time. And so now as restrictions have lifted, there are new things, new kind of realities in front of us. What we want to remember when faced with the challenge, 5.5 months ago, we were able to get and create new routines and adjust. And so moving forward, when we do have a challenge, using that as a reference point is really powerful, because that's resilience. You were able to bounce back. And so one of the tools that we use to develop self-regard is this. We get people to do an inventory of the past 6 months to 2 years of obstacles and setbacks that they were able to get through. And this becomes evidence for them that they were able to rely on their strengths and abilities to get through those challenges. Last week when I was working with teachers, and there was this fear of, September, school's opening up, not knowing where they're going to be, and so on and so forth. And my commentary to them was this: 5.5 months ago, you adjusted. You had to give yourself time to adjust, but you were able to come up with solutions, and you'll do it again, right? And giving us that time to adjust is critical. Now, when we think about self-regard, it's very important to consider the language that we use with ourselves, because self-talk is how we make our emotions real, right? So let me illustrate this in a few examples with you. Let's say I were to give every single person in this call today, in this session today, 100 pieces of feedback. And out of those 100 pieces of feedback, 98 pieces were positive, fantastic, you did it, great job. And then 2 pieces of feedback, not so much. What is it that we focus on? Do we focus on the 98% of positive feedback, or do we focus on the 2% that isn't that great? And we call this phenomenon is called negativity bias. And it's negativity bias because we focus on that 2%. And so when we think about this, it's important for us to understand that oftentimes we put value on that feedback that isn't so great, even though we just received 98% of fantastic feedback. And it impacts how we feel about ourselves. And we use self-talk, right? To really, we use self-talk to look at how that feedback is connected to who we are. And now I can talk about feedback of others, but I can also talk about the feedback that we give ourselves. So here's a question for you, and we're going to use the chat box. You have a friend, you have a peer, you have a sibling, a partner, someone you work with, and you adore this person, you love this person, and they tried something and they completely failed. They're crying, they're upset, and they come to you for support. What are some things that you might say to that person? So we're going to use the chat box. What might you say to that person? Okay, so I'm just going to go over to the chat box to see what you've said. At least they tried. What can I do for you? Hey, let's do it again together. Things happen for a reason, and your journey is to go through this. You learn by failing. Pro, con, and how did it go? Relate a story of your own failure. They went out of their comfort zone and you're proud of them. You might say, I'm here for you. What can I do to help? You might ask, how do you feel? Excellent. Such a supportive group. I love it. Okay. Now, the next question is this. I want to read the last thing that came out. Wisdom is the booby prize given when you've been unwise. Thank you for that. Excellent. Such a great group. Okay, here's my next question. We're not going to use the chat box for this, but I want you to think about this question and think to yourself about this. Now you have failed at something. What do you say to yourself? And how many of us can admit that it is not as positive as what it is that we say to those that we love and care about when they have failed at something? I'd be the first to admit that. Now here's my next question and my real question. My real question is this. If your friend spoke to you the way that you speak to yourself, would you be friends with that person? If your friend spoke to you the way that you speak to yourself, would you be friends with that person? So some of you may be laughing at the question. Some of you are shaking your head no. And most of us would not be friends with ourselves. And that's powerful because it impacts our self-regard. So we take the time to build up others, which is important. We want to do that. We want to build up those that we care about, but we don't take the time to build up ourselves. We don't speak to ourselves like someone we love. And oftentimes it's because of this. We have an inner critic. We all have an inner critic. Some inner critics are a little bit louder than other inner critics. Those disapproving thoughts, those feelings of shame, of guilt, of failure. And the thing is, what's very important about our inner critic is that there are consequences. Those who score high on self-criticism, they tend to have less friends or are less satisfied with social support. Number two, which is critical to resilience and bouncing back from the challenges that we face, those who score high on self-criticism, they use more negative communication after a stressful event. So what does that mean? They're going through a challenge, they're using more negative communication, it is taking them longer to bounce back. Right? We know that there are people that have gone through the last 5.5 months who are blaming themselves for things that they can't control. And although this is not rooted in logic, what it's rooted in is past thought patterns and behaviors. And so when we think about self-talk, it's about being intentional about the language that we use with ourselves. Dr. Fred Luskin's research says that each one of us has about 60,000 thoughts every single day. Of those 60,000 thoughts, 90% are repetitive. So think about what it is that you're repeating to yourself every single day. How is that impacting your self-regard? And the other piece here, and the tool, the strategy, is to become the critic of your inner critic. Realistically challenge the negative communication that you use with yourself. Speak to yourself like someone you love. And guess what? If that's too fluffy for you, fine. Speak to yourself like you would speak to your friend. Because self-talk is how we make our emotions real. And it impacts our self-confidence. It impacts our self-regard. Okay? The next piece we're going to speak about is self-actualization. And oftentimes we look at this in terms of, the legacy that we want to leave. And when actually it's really about the legacy that we want to live, how we want to show up every single day. We connect self-actualization with success and happiness and productivity. Now, here's the thing. Each one of us had a definition. We created a definition of productivity pre-pandemic. Then the world changed. Yet, for most of us, our definitions of productivity and success and happiness didn't change. And we're comparing ourselves to those definitions from pre-pandemic. Right? And we're harder on ourselves. I'm the parent of a beautiful 4-year-old boy. And I can tell you over the last 5.5 months that parent guilt has been very real. And thinking about that, I had to take that step back and say, okay, how am I defining parenting right now? What am I comparing myself to? And when we think about things like productivity, happiness, and success, we've each created a definition of that. And we compare ourselves against it. And sometimes when it comes to self-actualization, it's about redefining what we think productivity is, what success is, what happiness is, and understand where is it that I find meaning and purpose. Shawn Achor did a huge study on happiness, and he found that happiness is the precursor to success, not merely the result. And what do we mean by this? Oftentimes we have this notion of, if I get that, then I'll be happy. If I get that promotion, if I get that electronic device, if I get this, if I had that, then I'll be happy. But what the study says is that happiness actually comes before. And we need to get rid of those if-then statements, right? And focus on happiness. And we're going to talk at the end about the sub-skills that we're exploring today and how it connects to overall happiness and well-being. All right, back to the chat box. I have to say, I love how engaged you are, and thank you for contributing in the chat box. Here's my question, and there's a reason we're asking this, I promise. So what has been one challenge that you have experienced from the change in the last 171 days? So we're going to go over to the chat box. One challenge that you've experienced from the change in the last 171 days. Now you can send that message to everyone or in a private message to me, and I'll read it out loud without reading your name. So completely up to you. Okay. All right, one challenge has been dealing with Zoom and technology. I'll share with you, I had a session I was running last week, and 15 minutes before the session, there was a Zoom blackout. And so I had to refer to Microsoft Teams, but technology has definitely been a challenge. Thank you for sharing that. I've got nothing at all. Amazing. Not being able to travel to my family in the States, working in the homeless field, absolutely. Job insecurity. I've got a message sent to me privately, depression, and that's very, very real. Very real during this time. What I'm actually going to do is at the end of our session, when I send you the slides as well as the feedback survey, I'm going to send you a list of mental health resources as well that are available across Canada. Not knowing if and when I'll be allowed to go to work, connecting to technology, reorganizing the schedule to figure out new tasks, working with new colleagues, lack of support system for my kids, absolutely no babysitters, extended family visits, feeling burdened by fear, absolutely, not being able to hug family and friends, disability issues that are not Zoom friendly become more, thank you for sharing that, because absolutely, there are so many accessibility issues when it comes to technology, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about practical empathy. Become more sympathetic to others. As a 68-year-old introvert, claiming my 2 meters in public spaces, yes. Eating too much and drinking too much. Thank you for sharing that. Definitely have ice cream on the mind often. Will I have some after this session? Maybe. Thank you to everyone for engaging in that and for sharing your challenges. Because it's one thing to feel, you know, and we're going to talk about stress today, to feel anxious and to feel stressed. And it's another to actually identify what that stressor is, because when we think about emotional self-awareness, identifying those triggers is so important. Because again, only when we identify the triggers can we develop strategies in order to manage it. Right? Only when we identify the triggers. It's important for me in the sessions that I run to have closed captioning on. And this is something that I learned throughout the Zoom experience in the last 5.5 months, whether I'm using Microsoft Teams or another platform, is what can I do to have closed captioning on? Right? Because I understand that this can be a trigger for some individuals who are participants in some of my sessions. And so for you, when you're thinking about emotional self-awareness, what are the triggers that put you in a not so great emotional state, but also identifying what are the triggers that put you in a great emotional state? How do we add more of that in times that are challenging? And how do we manage those triggers that may not put us in a great emotional state, right? So the example that we can use is a technology. So I've given you the example of, you know, Zoom had a blackout last week. I had to have a backup plan. For me, having backup plans, because this is how I conduct businesses virtually, has been really, really important. Another trigger or strategy I'm going to give you is this. So we know, generally speaking, that when someone's computer crashes, it can create as much stress as moving to a different house or the loss of a loved one, right? And so if we know that a computer crashing can cause that stress, and a lot of that stress has to do with losing important files and pictures and memories and videos, the question for us becomes, how many of us back up our documents? And so what am I getting at here is this. If we know a trigger of stress can be losing all of my documents, or perhaps on my phone, the pictures of my son or the videos, then a strategy that I can implement is ensuring that I back up my documents on a weekly basis. I back up my pictures so that I don't lose them. So again, the goal here with emotional self-awareness is identify the trigger, and then you can develop the strategies in order to manage it. I briefly said that we also want to identify the triggers that put us in a great emotional state. And the reason we want to do that, because again, we want to integrate more of that into our day-to-day. I know that those triggers that put you in a great emotional state pre-pandemic, some of you have been limited in what you can do during the last 5.5 months, whether it's hugging your family or friends. For some people, it's going to the gym. So what we want to do is create strategies that are context and circumstance specific. And so for me, during this time, I have a 4-year-old son who is with me one-on-one, 5.5 days out of 7 days, where I cannot work during those times. And something that helps me through that is going for walks. And so in my context, in my circumstance, that's a strategy that I've used to help me manage over the last 5.5 months. So we've spent most of our time talking about self-perception, and I do tend to spend most of the time in that piece because when we think about things like self-regard and self-perception and how we feel about ourselves, this is foundational to our emotional intelligence and also navigating the challenges that we face. The next piece we're going to speak about is self-expression. So there are 3 ways that we send messages. We give off messages through our nonverbal communication, through the words that we use, as well as our tone. And that can come from punctuation. You've seen my emails now. I use lots of exclamation marks, which we're going to talk about in a second. But when we actually don't have nonverbal communication, some of us don't share our screens, which is completely fine. When that nonverbal communication is removed, there's more of an emphasis that's placed on the words that we use as well as our tone. You can think about the example of an email. If you were to receive an email and it is one word, all capital letters, and there's a period at the end of the word, that comes across in a specific way. And so nonverbal communication is removed, so the words that we choose and the punctuation that we choose, the font color that we choose, actually matters more. As an educator, I'm encouraged not to use red ink when I mark assignments. And the reason is because red ink can be offensive to some cultures. I'm encouraged to use green ink. So the color of my ink matters. When I was working with an IT company, I mentioned I use lots of exclamation marks. I had the head of the company call me and ask me what was wrong. And I said, I don't know. What do you mean what's wrong? I'm very excited to work with you and your team. And he said to me, when we see exclamation marks, we see that as urgent. And how I view exclamation marks is excitement. But there was misinterpretation, miscommunication there simply because of a punctuation mark. And so when we think about self-expression and how we choose to express ourselves, it's being consistent with the different channels. Nonverbal communication, if that's included, the words that we use, as well as our tone. Emerson says, what you do speaks so loudly that I cannot hear what you say. So the next piece we're going to talk about is assertiveness. And after we finish this section, I'm going to open it up to questions, and then we're going to take a short break. Now, assertiveness, what's interesting about this is when I speak to people about assertiveness, I often get, I didn't want to say anything because I'm going to come across as aggressive, but I don't say anything because I don't want to be seen as aggressive. And so what ends up happening is that they're passive. And what assertiveness actually is, it's the midpoint between being passive and being aggressive. It's being able to get your points across, but in a way that's non-offensive and respectful. And so it's not to say that we're not going to say anything at all. And the other side of it isn't that, I'm going to come across and be disrespectful. How do we become assertive in a way that we are able to say what we want, but we're respectful and non-offensive? And I'm going to show you one of the most powerful tools that I have come across in leadership development that comes from the Harvard Business School on how we can do this. So I want you to think about this. And you know what? If you want to share in the chat box, let's do that. My question is this. When you were a child, how did you get your way? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about that. Use the chat box. You're trying to get your way, and you have to get your way from your guardians, your parents, whoever it might be. What did you do? How did you get your way as a child? So we'll go over to the chat box. Let's see what you have to say for those who want to respond. All right. I would ask my grandma, go to my dad. I cried, go to my mom. As a child, I never got my way. I would do it myself or go to the grandma. I went to my father, only girl, 4 brothers. See, you had strategies. I love this. Excellent. Try and convince mom and dad, discuss it with them, discuss my reasons, both positive and negative. Never got my way, only with my grandma, became stubborn and dug my heels in. I love it. Thank you for sharing. Now, my next question is this, and we don't have to use the chat box for it, but I want you to think about this. What happens when you didn't get your way? Right? So you tried to get your way, you tried perhaps convincing them, maybe you went to grandma or your dad or your mom, and you didn't get your way. So some of us may have stomped up to our room, shut the door, ignored someone for 2 weeks. I did that. Some of us may have had tantrums. We might have thrown things, we might have thrown tantrums, right? So we all respond to not getting our way. Now, I'm not going to ask you if you still do that today, but think about what happened when you didn't get your way. Now, here's the thing. We are programmed to either fight or flight, right? Some of us freeze, which is a form of flight, but we are programmed to either flight or fight. Those tantrums, we were fighting. We running up to our rooms, that was flight. And we call this spectrum silence to violence, or passive and aggressive. So some examples could be withholding information, masking, withdrawal, convincing, controlling, attacking. But what we often forget, especially when emotions are charged, is that somewhere in the middle, there is dialogue. Instead of fight, flight, silence, violence, passive, aggressive, somewhere in the middle, there's dialogue. And that's assertiveness. Now, if I were to ask all of you, anyone ever have a challenging conversation before, my assumption is that all of our hands would go up. You may say to me, Ramit, I had a challenging conversation this morning. We have challenging conversations often. But here's what's fascinating. I love Dr. Chris Regis' work. He is a Harvard Business School professor, behavioral psychologist, and he speaks about challenging conversations. And what he says is this, that in those challenging conversations that you've had, and I want you to think about one, could have been personally, could have been professionally, could have been recently, could have been in the past. In that challenging conversation, I want you to think about this. Most people are unaware of the degree to which they are not trusting and open, of the extent to which their conversations don't reflect what they actually think and feel. And the reason is because there's a difference between intentions and whether or not we share them. When we're in those challenging conversations, we judge others based on their behavior, while the entire time we judge ourselves based on our intentions. We are actually not effective observers of our own behavior. And what's fascinating about this is that the other person is doing the same thing. They're judging you based on your behavior, while they judge themselves based on their intention. So in those challenging conversations, you're each judging yourselves based on behavior, judging each other based on your behavior or their behavior, and judging yourselves based on your own intentions. And this is where lots of misunderstandings occur. So how do we manage this? How do we approach challenging conversations? Right? This formula, again, created by Dr. Chris Regis. And this is what he says. You start with the facts. You share your intention and you frame it in a way that encourages dialogue. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. Let's say you are working with someone and we're going to call that person Simone. So you're working with Simone and Simone comes late to work on Thursdays and Fridays. And you are the one that has to have this conversation with Simone. So you might say, well, when we think about this conversation, we often make up stories about a person who comes in late. They're always late, they don't care, they were drinking the night before, they're impacting our team. We have these stories that we create about that person. And so if we were to approach Simone and use this formula, this is what it would sound like. Simone, you are late on Thursdays and Fridays. That's the fact. She's not actually late every day. She's only late on Thursdays and Fridays. Simone, you're late on Thursdays and Fridays, and it's impacting our team. That's your intention. That's why you're having the conversation. We would end it off with, is there something you want to talk about? Because here's the thing, we have no idea what's going on in Simone's life on Thursdays and Fridays. All we know is that those are the dates that she's late on. And so opening it up to dialogue, we're able to be assertive, get our points across, but it gives the other person an opportunity to share their intention and perspective. Simone, I noticed you're late on Thursdays and Fridays. It's impacting our team. Is there something you want to talk about? Now, another example is we can use this to be assertive and to perhaps address someone that may have shared something that doesn't sit well with us. So instead of articulating that example, I'm going to read off of the next slide where I had someone who sat in on a session with me and actually implemented the strategy with a situation they had with a senior lawyer. So I'm going to read the bottom 3 lines out loud. In a meeting today, a senior female lawyer told me to calm down while I was explaining a possible solution. Other people in the room agreed I was calm, and I felt calm. I approached her after saying, you said X in the meeting, that's the fact. It came across as X, that's the intention, that's why she's having this conversation. Is that what you intended? She's now opened it up to dialogue. She apologized, explained that she was simply stressed, and we had a great conversation. Thank you for this tool. As someone who's naturally very non-confrontational, I will be using that strategy for life. Because here's the thing, if she did not address this during that meeting, she would have carried on that interaction with her to the next meeting and the next interaction that she had with the senior lawyer. She was able to address it right away, and they were able to have a conversation about it. We start with the facts, we share our intentions, and we open it up to dialogue. I love this quote, our stories create our emotions, but we are the ones that create our stories. Now, before we continue, I want to open up the floor to any questions that you may have at this point before we go on a short break. Okay. Let's see if you have any questions. You can unmute yourself or you can use the chat box. I've got the chat box open right now. If we have any questions, or again, you can unmute yourself if you would like to. Okay, so I don't see any questions and no one has unmuted. So we are going to take a 15-minute break right now, and we're going to start right back up at 2 p.m. We're going to have a short 5-minute stretch break in between, sorry, I'm at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to have a short 5-minute stretch break between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But at this moment, we're going to take a 15-minute break, and I will see you here again at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Enjoy your break. We will get started in 2 minutes. We are going to get started in 2 minutes. All right, so we are going to get started again. I just want to do a quick check-in in the chat box. How is everyone feeling? How is everyone doing? We just came back from a 15-minute break. How are we doing? All right, doing well, good, all good, thank you. Okay, great, you're doing okay, that's good. Excellent, thank you. Enjoying this, wonderful. You're doing great, good. Love the check-in and thank you for sharing that. The other reason I do that, and I'm gonna share with you what another company does, is it helps us to engage in mindful thinking. How am I feeling right now? Another organization does this at the beginning of every meeting that they have virtually. They ask this question to all participants, and what they say is this: if you could be anywhere else in the world right now, where would you be? And so participants will share Greece, perhaps, Argentina, my family's house, whatever it might be. And the thing about this question, even though they're asking if you could be anywhere else outside of here, they're asking right now. If you could be anywhere else right now, where would you be? And from a neuroscience perspective, it allows people to engage in mindful thinking, coming back to the present moment. Okay, if I could be anywhere right now, or how am I feeling right now? This matters. There was a comment in the chat box. You should be able to see my slides. I am using slides throughout this presentation. If you do have any issues with the slides, please do log out and log back in. That should be helpful. I love that a few of you have answered the question of where you would be right now, and outside is one. That's where I was on my break. And Nanaimo, yes, beautiful. So thank you for answering that. So we're going to move on. So we spent our first hour together speaking about self-perception, how we view ourselves, and then also then self-expression, how we choose to express ourselves to others, whether that's through different channels. So what we're going to do now is shift over to interpersonal. So when we think about emotional intelligence, yes, it starts with self-perception, and that's the foundation of it, building on self-expression. Well, how does it then connect to interpersonal? The first subscale that's connected to interpersonal is interpersonal relationships. Now, every single one of us, we have various different relationships depending on the hat that we're wearing, whether that's personal, whether that's professional, whether that's academically, we have different relationships. And when we think about the relationships from the lens of emotional intelligence, what we want to think about and understand is whether or not the relationships that we have are mutually beneficial. So depending on the relationship you might have, let's take a professional relationship as an example. If you are someone who requires constant and consistent feedback, and that's not something your manager provides you with, then your need is not being met in your role. And so thinking about needs being met, that's what we consider when we talk about a relationship that is mutually beneficial. So in each of the relationships that you have, your needs are going to vary, and your need is not going to be the same need that the other person has. So our first step with interpersonal relationships is identifying what our needs are in the relationships that we have, and then understanding whether or not those needs are being met, and also giving the other an opportunity to meet those needs. And we've now learned how to be assertive in order to do so. Now, Robin Sharma says that you are the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time around. Think about the 5 people you spend the most time around. And 6 months ago, it may have been very different than the past 5.5 months. But the people that we spend the most time around, or that we communicate the most with, they absolutely have an impact on how we feel about ourselves. They have an impact on how we act, how we react, how we interact. And so it's understanding, again, who is it that I'm spending the most time around? Are my needs being met in those relationships? And if they're not, how can I communicate my needs in a way that's respectful and non-offensive? Now, here's the thing. Let's say you have someone in your life that puts you in a not so great emotional state. We all have 1 or 2 of those in our lives that we can't really delete, right? Well, the other thing is to understand how we communicate with them and when. So for example, if I know there's this one person that puts me in a not so great emotional state, I might not choose to communicate with them first thing in the morning if I can help it. Because there was a study that came out of the University of Florida in 2015 that showed that every time you interact with someone you think is rude, the next person that interacts with you is going to think you're rude. And we call this emotional contagion. And oftentimes, it's a domino effect. So the next person that interacts with them is going to think they're rude, and so on and so forth. Well, how do we stop that? We stop that by taking time to recover. So let's say we have to meet them in the morning. I had a client who every time she met with her boss, she put in 10 minutes in her calendar after that. And in those 10 minutes, she either went for a walk around the block, or she went and got a coffee, or she sat in her space. And what she was doing was she was taking time to recover. You see, when we don't take the time to recover from those relationships that are they just don't put us in a great emotional state, it seeps into other parts of our lives and other relationships that we have and interactions that we have. Now, you might say to me, Ramit, fantastic, I love that. However, I don't have 10 minutes, right? I'm busy. Okay, great. Don't take 10 minutes, take 5. You might also say to me, I don't have 5 minutes. Fine, take 2 minutes, right? And if you say to me you don't have 2 minutes, the question becomes, is it worth it not taking 2 minutes in order to recover from those situations, then have it impact the next interaction that you have? Now, if you are in a position where you don't have to interact with that person first thing in the morning, perhaps you interact with them at the end of the day when you know that you won't need as much energy, and you wouldn't have to put that much focus into those conversations. Again, depending on who that relationship is with, and whether or not you're able to do that. What we want to do here as it relates to emotional intelligence on every one of these subskills that we talk about is build our awareness, right? If it's as simple as, oh, wait, who am I spending time around? And how is that impacting how I feel? That in itself is powerful, because what we're doing is we're becoming intentional with who we expend energy with, how we speak to ourselves, how we express ourselves, our assertiveness. We're becoming intentional. And that's huge to our self-awareness. The next piece is empathy. So again, we briefly chatted about this earlier. Think about how you yourself are experiencing the pandemic. When I asked the question, one challenge that you've experienced in the last 171 days, we had various different responses to that question. If you think about even outside of this group, how people have experienced this has varied. I know between the months of March and June, every time I lived near a public library, every time I would drive by the public library, there would be youth surrounding it. And the reason there was youth surrounding it is because they were trying to access the free Wi-Fi. They didn't have stable Wi-Fi at home. And so when we think about things like online learning, not everyone experiences in the same way. There was a debate around teachers making their children turn on their video cameras to show engagement, where some students were embarrassed of their background and they didn't want to turn on their video camera. When there were issues, there are issues around our world happening as it relates to things like Black Lives Matter. And people did not want to turn on their cameras because they were grieving. And so when we think from a leadership lens, when we think about emotional intelligence and connect it to empathy, practical empathy is critical, right? What is empathy? Empathy is using someone else's reference points in order to understand how they're experiencing a situation. It encourages us to put our own biases, our own assumptions aside, and to use another's reference point to understand how they might be experiencing the situation. Empathy seeks shared meaning, and Daniel Pink says it's about standing in someone else's shoes, feeling with his or her heart, seeing with his or her eyes, and not only is empathy hard to outsource and automate, but it makes the world a better place. And so when we think about empathetic leadership, again, we're encouraged to put our own biases and assumptions aside. The second we say to someone, I've gone through something similar, I know how you feel, you're going to get through this, that is sympathy, not empathy. Because when we say, I know how you feel, we're using our own reference points in an attempt to understand them versus their reference points in order to understand what it is they might be experiencing. All right, so the next piece we're going to talk about is decision making. Now, you might say to me, I am a great decision maker, problem solving, it's a part of my job, and that's fantastic. You may be a fantastic critical problem solver. My question becomes, what happens when emotions are involved? When you are emotionally charged, or the person you're interacting with is emotionally charged, does that impact the way in which you solve problems, the way in which you frame problems? And so when we think about this, think again about a challenge that you've experienced or faced. It's looking at, okay, what language am I using to frame the problem ahead of me? And also the language I'm using with myself in order to get through it. Now, I used to teach a social entrepreneurship course at Humber College, and about 4 weeks into my course, my students would come in, they would sit down, and what I would do is I would put up this slide for them. And I would ask my students, I would say, okay, can he drive a car on his own? And 99% of their hands would go up, no, miss, he can't, no, miss, he can't, no, miss, he can't. The other 1% had like big headphones in their ears, couldn't hear a thing that I was saying. But everyone else, no, miss, he can't. And then no one asks me why I put up this slide. And so when we think about that, what ends up happening is no one asks me, they all say no, I move on. 45 minutes after I do my lecture, I'm about to go on break with them, and I say, okay, before break, I'm going to put you into groups of 4 or 5. You get 5 minutes, and in your groups, I want you to answer the following questions. And what I do is I put up this slide. And the slide says, how can he drive a car on his own? So they go into their groups, 5 minutes, they brainstorm, and they come up with solutions, share and group share, and the solutions are phenomenal. Right? Actually, real life solutions on how this young man may be able to drive a car on his own. Automatic this, Google that, self-driving this. They've come up with things that they've seen in the past that could potentially work. Now, there's a reason I'm sharing this anecdote with you, and I do it every single semester. How is it that the exact same group of people, every semester, different class, multiple classes in one semester, how is it that the same people that say, no, he can't, 45 minutes later are coming up with solutions on how this young man can potentially drive a car on his own? Now, nothing in my lecture would have helped them. You see, the only thing I did was put the word how in front of the question. Instead of asking them, can he drive a car on his own? I put the word how in front of the question. How can he drive a car on his own? You see, when we ask ourselves, can I do this? Can they do this? Can she? Can he? It's binary. Yes, no, we move on. Because research suggests we each make about 35,000 decisions every single day. If you take into account multiple different things, we're making about 2,000 to 3,000 decisions an hour. So if I'm asking this question, nope, we move on. The second we put the word how in front of the question, our brain becomes solution focused. We start searching for reference points, things that we might have seen in the past to try in an attempt to solve for this problem. Think about the many times you've asked yourself, can I do this? Can they do this? Or even if we think about New Year's resolutions, right? The question isn't, can I? The question is always, how am I going to? Or how can I? And the power of language is so huge, and I want to say powerful again, when we think about solving for problems. Let me illustrate it in a few other ways. I love this image. Nobody ever asks, how's Waldo? We always ask, where's Waldo? But if we think about this question, it's a bit flawed too because of the power of language. If you go back to one of the first slides I showed you today, 77% of Canadians, when they're asked the question, how are you? They reply with, I'm fine, thanks. So if we look at that question, how are you? What do? We reframe it. My best friend says to me all the time, tell me how you're doing. She's reframed the automatic, how are you? I would respond, I'm fine, thanks. How are you? Right? Automaticity, let's break that. Change up the question. Another colleague, tell me a challenge that you're facing. Right? We can reframe how we ask questions, especially if we fall into automaticity and are asking the same routine questions and receiving the same routine responses. Let me illustrate it in another way. One of the most powerful studies I've ever come across. And so, give me 1 second. I'm just checking the chat box before we go into this. So let me just do a quick check into the chat box. I see that it's flashing a little bit. I just want to see. Okay, before I get into the study, let me respond to some of the questions because I think that's important before I share this and we move forward. So one of the questions is, what happens when the manager does not respond to emails? One thing I would do in response to that, if a manager isn't responding to emails, what I would personally do is perhaps instead of sending emails, I may pick up the phone and try to call that person. I'm sure you've tried that already. And the reason I say that, or I would try a different form of communication. It could be that the manager is overwhelmed with emails. There could be many different reasons as to why a manager doesn't respond to emails. Again, we won't know unless we open it up to dialogue. But if I do need to communicate with that person and emails isn't the method that's working, what I would do is I would attempt different methods in order to communicate with them. And I would also share or ask them and throw it on them and say, you know, what method do you prefer to communicate in? Because then you give them an opportunity to share with you how they want to respond, and that might be helpful in that situation. Okay, okay, I'm just gonna make sure that I've answered all the questions. I love all these comments. Thank you. Please keep them coming in as we're going through the different pieces because it can help others that are reading along. Okay, I love this. Don't say you empathize if you really have no idea. That can be disrespectful. Absolutely. When we say, I am trying to use your reference points, but you don't have any idea, it can come across as disrespectful. And what we want to get to with empathy is understanding. And a big piece of that is understanding that we might not have any clue as to how someone else is feeling, and that's okay. But to say that we do, that's where it can be disrespectful. To ask questions about how they might be experiencing a situation can allow us to get to shared meaning and understanding. All right, excellent. So thank you for that. I'm glad we addressed those. Now, my favorite study, and you'll see why. So I'm a consultant with various different organizations, especially in the healthcare system, and I came across this study. Now, this study was done, I have to say, pre-pandemic. And it really speaks to the power of language and the power that one word can make. I'm not going to read off the slide, but again, you're going to get a copy of the slides so that you have this with you. Now, the context is we're going to talk about pre-pandemic. Let's say you have hurt your elbow and you've hurt it badly enough that you've called your doctor. And you've called your doctor to make an appointment because you've hurt your elbow. That's what your need is. That's what drove you to call your doctor to make that appointment. Now, let's also say over the last 2 months, you've been having, some headaches, some back pain, you have these symptoms. It didn't encourage you to call your doctor, and you may or may not talk about the headaches and the back pain. We're going to call these your unmet needs. Now, pre-pandemic, unmet needs were one of the greatest costs to the healthcare system in North America. So what this study did was it set out to see if through language they can actually reduce unmet needs. So it took 3 groups of physicians, Group A, Group B, and Group C. It said to Group A, the study said, Group A, when your patients come in today, at the end of each patient visit, you are to ask them, is there anything else you want to talk about? Group B, you are to ask your patients at the end of the visit, is there something else you want to talk about? Group C, you don't ask your patients anything at all. You are our control group. Now, this is what they found. They found that Group B, the one that asked the patients, is there something else you want to talk about? They were able to reduce unmet needs by 78%. Now, Group A, the one that asked, is there anything else you want to talk about? They were not able to reduce unmet needs, and there was no difference between that group and the control group that didn't ask anything at all. And what was even more fascinating, the group that asked, is there something else, that was able to reduce unmet needs by 78%, their length in patient visit did not exceed Group A, who asked, is there anything else? There was no difference in the length of time or visit time for patients. Now, how do we apply this to our work as leaders? How do we apply this to ourselves? How can we apply this to pandemic? The only difference between Group A and Group B was the word any and some. Is there anything else you want to talk about? Is there something else you want to talk about? So when we think about that in our context as leaders, how many times do we ask people, is there anything else? Is there anything I can help you with? Are there any questions? What if we simply change the word from any to some? Are there some questions? Is there something else? Is there something I can help you with? The power of a word. I will tell you, I use this strategy now during pandemic. My parents are very stubborn. That's where I get it from. And I do not ask them, is there anything I can do for you? I always say to them, what is something I can do? Tell me something I can bring. Because the power of a word. And so when we think about it in our own context, again, being intentional about the language that we use, attempting to solve for problems, is there something else? It can make all the difference. The next piece we're going to talk about is reality testing. And when we think about reality testing as it relates to emotional intelligence, what we're talking about here is objective reasoning. Do we look at problems and challenges as they are? Are we objective when we're faced with challenges, or do we allow our emotions to dictate how we might feel about something, especially if we're making decisions about it as leaders? And so when we think about what's in front of us, it's also understanding, and this is where that self-awareness piece really makes a difference. It's understanding that sometimes we can be wrong. So I taught a leadership course for over 6 years, multiple different sections and students in higher education. On the first day of class, every time my students would come in, I would ask them the following question. I would say to them, those who don't know me, never took a class with me, how many of you thought that I'd be a man? And they laugh and they giggle. 90% of their hands go up. Yes, miss. Sorry, miss. Haha, miss. How'd you know, miss? And I ask them why. Oh, miss, because of your name. You see, when they get their schedules, they don't get Mr. or Miss, they get Professor Ramit Billen, and my name is gender neutral. But without fail, every semester, over 90% will think walking into class that I was going to be a man, and that's not how I identify. Now, they come in and they see me as their teacher and they shift, but they don't even realize that they made that assumption and it changed after seeing me. Now, here's the thing. What they were doing was just trying to make understanding, right? They making assumptions and biases. This is natural. It's a part of human nature. But the question is, how many times do we take that step back and ask ourselves, could I be wrong? And how I'm judging the person in front of me, how I might be judging the situation in front of me. What are the assumptions that I am making here? And it's important as leaders to understand that, sometimes we can be wrong. We have limited information about a person or a situation and we make assumptions about it. Again, human nature, we're trying to make understanding. But what if the decisions that we are making are having unintended consequences for specific people and or groups? And so I'll share another story, an example of this. When I traveled to Africa for a number of years on different school building initiatives, in the communities that I would work in, I was often referred to as a white man. For those who can see me on video, my assumption is that I do not look like a white man to you. And so in those communities, that they did not have another word to describe me because many people had not seen someone of my skin color. My mannerisms different, my body language is different. And so the word that they had to describe me was white man, and they were wrong. And so when we think about the words that we use and the labels that we create for people, sometimes we're very quick to label, but don't actually know the full picture or full idea. There's another organization I work with, and we try to ensure around accessibility for that organization and beyond. And so we got descriptors for the pictures that we post, and they analyzed this picture and described it as white woman with 5 African children in front of a stone building. And I don't identify as a white woman. And so this is an organization that has done this for all of that. That is the organization. This is what they do. And even they can be wrong. And so when we think about reality testing, when we think about the challenges that we face, and understanding that, as Kavi says, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. We use our own reference points in an attempt to understand what's in front of us. And that actually stands in the way of being empathetic. And so what we want to do is challenge our own assumptions, the assumptions that we make, because as leaders, when we're making decisions, this is critical, especially when we have limited information about a person or a situation. My colleague always says to me, and I hold this closely, she says, when something happens, she says to me, don't fall into story. And sometimes we fall into story versus facts, stories about a person, about a situation, based on their behavior and not their intention. When we're making decisions, they should be grounded in the reality of those that we serve. And again, Kavi says, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. All right. The next piece is stress management. What I'm going to do right now, and I'm going to give you 5 minutes, I'm going to actually put you into breakout groups. And what you're going to do in your breakout groups, and in 5 minutes, is you are going to share with those in your breakout groups one thing that is stressing you out right now. And so give yourselves about a minute each to be able to share one thing that is stressing you out right now. So I'm going to put you in breakout rooms, and then I will give you a 1-minute warning where you can join the main group, and we'll get started on this piece, which is the final piece before we talk about happiness and well-being. So in your breakout rooms, one thing each of you that is stressing you out right now. So breakout rooms, let's do this. Give me, and here we go. Have fun.
come and look. I'll turn myself off here. Don't worry.
Wasn't working for them.
There we go. Okay. Oh, audio too.
Okay, so we're just waiting for everyone to return. And if you're able to mute yourselves, that would be wonderful. All right, so we're just waiting for everyone to return, and then we're going to take a quick short break, and then we're going to get started again. All right, so welcome back, everyone. And there was a reason that we did that activity, and a big piece, again, goes back to what we've been talking about, and that's identifying what our triggers are. So oftentimes we might say things like, I'm stressed, I'm overwhelmed, but we don't know exactly what might be stressing us out right now. I know, for example, 5.5 months ago when I was doing training sessions, what stressors people had at that time aren't the stressors that they're having right now. And if I were to talk to them 6 months ago, pre-pandemic, their stressors at that point may not be the same stressors as right now. So understanding what it is that is stressing you out during this time, whether it's over the last 5.5 months, or perhaps this week, is again important so that we can develop strategies in order to navigate and to manage it. And so this piece is going to talk about that, and it's going to let us get into the happiness and well-being piece right after a short 4-minute break. So we are going to get back started in 4 minutes. What I want you to do, if you're able to, is to take the next 4 minutes for a quick stretch break, because we should be up and moving about at least every 45 minutes, and we're getting close to that mark. So we're going to take a 4-minute break. I'm still going to be on here. I will give you a 1-minute warning, and we'll get started. This is the home stretch. Some more tools and practical strategies for you before we end off at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So let's take a 4-minute stretch break, and we'll get started right back up again. All right, so we're going to get started in 1 minute. We've got 1 minute to go before we start back up again. Okay, so I hope that you got a good stretch in there. Always important, especially when we're doing sessions online, to make sure that we are taking breaks and not waiting for an hour or an hour and a half. It gets the blood pumping back into the brain, the oxygen back into the brain. Home stretch here, the last 20 minutes, and we've got two important topics to talk about, which is stress management as well as happiness and well-being. So when we think about stress management, let me just share my screen here. I got overly excited there. When we think about stress management, the first piece that falls under this composite scales flexibility. And so it's that ability to adapt to a changing environment. And here's the thing, whether we liked it or not, 171 days ago, we all had to be flexible. We had to develop new ways of connecting, of interacting with each other. And again, it's not to say that it was optimal or maybe optimal for your specific situation, but we all engaged in flexibility because this was change that was done to us versus change that we initiated. And so when we think about resilience, as well as future challenges that we face, remembering that we were able to get through this is powerful, is extremely powerful. You were able to be flexible in order to respond to a pandemic. And so encouraging that flexibility and challenging and building that flexibility muscle is very important to being able to adapt to stress or stressful situations and the change that we experience. The next piece here is stress tolerance. So before this section, I asked you to share one thing that is stressing you out right now. And it's really, when we think about stress tolerance, it's coping and responding to that stressor in an effective way. So when we had our 15-minute break earlier, I sat outside because I know that being outside is a way that helps me to recover, even if it's for a short 15 minutes. So looking at strategies that work best for you is critical. And this is why I say that. It's because one shoe does not fit all. I don't have one strategy that I could recommend to everybody to use today. And the example I'll give you is this, is I've read so much about meditation. I've heard about it from people. They've showed me the apps. I believe in it. But in my current circumstance, in my context, it's not something that I practice. It may be something in the future, but it doesn't work for me right now. So understanding what works best for you, given your circumstance and your context, in a way to respond to change and cope with it, as well as change in the stressors that we experience, is critical. I may not have one strategy that fits everyone, but I do have an analogy. And the analogy is that of athletes. When an athlete is going to play a sport or run a marathon, they have certain strategies in place that they use in order to recover from the stress that they're putting on their bodies. They might do an ice bath, they might do certain stretches, they might have a meal plan. And the thing is, they know that they are putting stress on their body. And so these strategies help them to recover quickly. Now, whether we're athletes or not, my question to you becomes this: do you take time to recover from the stress that you put on your body every single day? So if we go back to what I started with, which is that every time we process an emotion, within 6 seconds, it impacts every living cell in our body. Right? We have a physical, a biological response. If we don't have strategies to manage our stress, it impacts us. We put stress on our bodies. Do we take time to recover? Now, that doesn't mean you have to take a spa day every Friday. Some of us can't even do that. It doesn't mean that, you have to take a full day off during the week. It doesn't mean that. It could mean 10 minutes in the day, right? It could mean 5 minutes in the day. It could mean actually taking a lunch break versus working through lunch. It could mean actually taking 15 minutes of a break every hour. Right? There are different ways in which we can recover. And with stress tolerance, what we want to focus on is the way that works best for you. You already did the hard part. You did the first piece of this, which is identifying what is one thing that's stressing you out right now. You did the hard part, right? We built our awareness. This is my stressor. Now it's about taking it a step further and saying, okay, how do I recover from this? If I'm unable to eliminate it, right? How do I manage it? And then also, how do I take time to recover? It's also about focusing on what we can control. So oftentimes with our stressors or things that may cause us slight anxiety, we focus on what we can't control versus what we can control. Now, I'm going to give you this example, very basic example, and this is it. When I was 19 years old, I got into a horrific car accident, and it had to do with the snow. Since that point, every time there's a snowstorm, it causes me heightened anxiety. And for years, days before leading up to the snowstorm, and I would check the weather every day, I would have heightened anxiety. And what I had to do was simply this, to reduce the amount of anxiety that I was experiencing, but also how I was experiencing it. What I realized a few years ago was that I cannot control the weather. Yes, it took me a long time to realize that, but I can't control the weather. There's going to be a snowstorm. If there's going to be a snowstorm, there's going to be a snowstorm. I cannot change that. So instead of the 2 or 3 days leading up to it having the anxiety, let's focus on what I can control. What I can control is whether or not I choose to drive on that day, whether I choose to have someone drive me. Will I take a cab? Will I cancel what I have that day? If I do drive, how fast am I going to drive? Am I going to give myself additional time if I choose to drive? Those are the things I can control. I can't control the snowstorm, right? I can't control the weather. So when we think about our stressors, it's identifying, okay, in this situation, what can I control versus what can't I control? And focusing on what it is that we can control and developing strategies in that way. The last piece is optimism. Now, it's not the person who's the most energetic and enthusiastic in the room that's the most optimistic. It really is, how do you view challenging situations? Do you view them as temporary or permanent? Those who view challenges as permanent, right? That's when something good happens. They view that as temporary. It's that idea of, oh, this is how it always is, how it's always going to be. Versus those who view those challenges as temporary, right? There's a challenge. Okay, what are we going to do to get through this? How are we going to get through this? They view those challenges as temporary versus permanent. The tool and strategy that I have here for you is this one. It's the exact same tool and strategy that I shared with you with self-regard, the first tool I shared with you. We do an inventory of the past 6 months to 2 years of obstacles and setbacks that we were able to get through. Why? Because it becomes evidence that those challenges were temporary and not permanent. And at the same time, we're developing your self-confidence. So how does this connect to happiness and well-being? Well, research shows from the emotional intelligence model, there are 4 sub-skills that we spoke about today that connect directly with happiness. And if we want to build our happiness and well-being, remember, it's a precursor to success, not the result of it. These are the ones we focus on. Our self-regard, the language we use with ourselves, becoming the critic of our inner critic. Self-actualization, where is it that we find purpose and meaning? How are we defining things like success, happiness, productivity? And it's not about the legacy you want to leave. Instead, it's about how you want to show up every single day. Interpersonal relationships, the relationships that you have, are they mutually beneficial? Are your needs being met? How do we nurture the ones that are so great for us? And how do we manage the ones that may not be? Being aware of the people that we spend the most time around. And optimism. How are we viewing those challenging situations? Are they permanent or are they temporary? You know, 171 days ago, that seems like a very, very long time. And there's a lot of change that's happened in those 171 days. And so even if we take the last 5.5 months as an example, right? Change isn't always, challenges can absolutely be temporary versus being permanent. And when we think about happiness and well-being, we want to connect this to post-traumatic growth, which another word of it is benefit finding. We talked today about the challenges that we've experienced in the last 171 days. You've shared a stressor that you might be experiencing right now. Well, post-traumatic growth talks about what are the benefits that we may have experienced over the last 171 days. Absolutely, there have been challenges. Absolutely. Right? For some of us, we've also experienced benefits. And so some examples may be a greater appreciation of life, some changed priorities. I can agree to that. Greater sense of personal strength, recognition of new possibilities. So when we think about benefits, it's important for us to say, okay, yes, these are the challenges, but you know, what good has come out of this for me personally? And so the last activity I'm going to get you to do is to use the chat box to share one benefit from your experience of change in the last 171 days. So I'm going to get you to fill up the chat box with that. And as you do that, I want to share one last piece. So I mentioned a few times I have a 4-year-old son, and I do this with him. He doesn't know what gratitude means. He doesn't know what benefit finding means, but he absolutely knows what favorite means. And so at the end of every single day, I ask him the question, what was your favorite part of the day? And what I'm getting him to do is engage in benefit finding. Last week, I asked him that question a little bit earlier on. And then later that night, he was looking at the stars and the moon. And at the end, he goes, actually, Mommy, my favorite part was looking at the stars. And why that was important was because of this. I had already asked him that question, but later on in the evening, he was benefit finding. He found something that was his favorite part, and his mind was searching for that. And that is a powerful thing. So I'm going to go over to the chat box to see what your benefit from the last 171 days is. At a little bit after our time together, you are going to see an email in your inbox with a link to the slides. Oh, sorry, a copy of the slides, a link to our survey, as well as some resources for you as it relates to mental health. So I want to go back here and I want to see what you've said in terms of a benefit that you've experienced. And then I also want to open up the floor to any questions. You can use the chat box or you can unmute yourself as we've got a few minutes left together. So here we go, learning strengths, having gratitude app on my phone and using it every day. Most places finally making passages that are wheelchair friendly, a better understanding of systemic racism and my role in it. Absolutely. I went back to school. I never had time to do so. My inner strength, having more downtime, my health and home I'm most grateful for, time with family. With things turning to mostly remote learning, I was able to enroll in a program, taking time to do things I love, virtual yoga with family, more one-on-one time with friends in parks. I have learned that it's okay just to be. This is amazing. I love all of this. You've filled up the chat box with all these amazing benefits that you've experienced in the last 171 days. And sometimes it's just about articulating it. So I want to thank you to all of you for joining today. I still see them coming in. I love it. Strong bonding with the family, being in this leadership group and learning new things. And I hope you learned a few new things today. Being grateful about being a part of this group, being with my family. Thank you so, so much to all of you and for being so engaged and participating. And your contributions have made this session so incredibly fun for me. And I've learned a lot from you. So thank you to all of you. So I'm just going to stay here in case there are any questions that you have for me. Again, you can unmute yourself or use the chat box. And again, thank you for all the kind messages coming in. I really, really appreciate that. Okay. So I don't see any questions. You will get an email from me, and my email address is in there. So if you have any questions, you're always more than welcome to reach out. More than happy to share any resources that I might have. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, whether you're coming from BC on one end where it's still morning time, or you're on the West End and it's a little later in the day. Have a wonderful start to the week, and thank you for allowing me to join you today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I am that person that does the double wave on Zoom, and so that's what I'm going to do to say goodbye. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care and goodbye.